In this Warmaster video, we'll look at the changes to the army lists that have been subject to proposals and voting by the Warmaster Rules Committee in 2024. The updated version of the army lists will be available from Alish Navratil's website, and I'll include a link below. However, for those players that own a physical copy of the army book and are worried about this being obsolete, don't worry. All the army list updates will also be published in a new document, the Warmaster Journal, which will be produced annually. So rather than reprint the entire army list, you just need to keep a copy of the Warmaster Journal to reference the army list changes for your faction. Or if you're old school, you can simply cut and paste the new PDF document pages onto your rulebook. The first army that's been subject to some very minor changes is the Empire, which has simply had some special rules wording clarified. First, we look at Empire skirmishers. The wording for their special rules has been streamlined so it's easier to comprehend, and it also falls in line with every other unit type that has this special rule from other armies. This improves standardization across multiple lists without changing any rules. Next, it's Pistoliers. If you look at their special rules, you'll see that the wording for their 360-degree vision has been streamlined, and all units that share this special rule will now have the same wording. It clarifies that the unit can see all round and draw line of sight for shooting and for initiative evades from any edge of their base, but they still require frontal line of sight to declare a charge. And finally, for the Empire, it's the Steam Tank, and its special rules have been clarified so that it's clear that only the shooting attacks impose a -1 armor penalty to the enemy. Next, we move on to the Tomb Kings, who've also had some minor wording changes. The only change is the wording to the Raised Dead spell, which now clearly states how a raised unit must be placed in combat. Each stand of Raised Dead must now be placed so that its front edge either contacts the enemy or supports a friendly stand, including raised stands. You are not allowed to split up one engagement into 2 or more engagements by placing Raised Dead, although provided you follow the rules above, any other enemy stands which are drawn into the combat through incidental contact via the placement of Raised Dead is permitted. If the Raised Dead cannot be placed so that they comply with these rules, then the spell fails and the unit does not appear. So this new wording curtails some of the more creative placement of Raised Dead, which may have been possible in the past, and is in effect a slight nerf to an otherwise very powerful spell. Next, we move on to Chaos, who have received an actual change to their army list. If you look at the army selector, you will see that Chaos Knights have finally been reduced in cost to 180 points a unit, although their min-max is now capped at 2 per 1,000 points. This now makes them a far more competitive pick, although prevents them from dominating at games of less than 2,000 points.
This will be a day long remembered.
Meanwhile, Chaos Spawn have had their 360-degree vision rule clarified in the same way as Pistoliers. Next, we move on to the Orcs, who've had a minor rules clarification. If you look at Goblin Wolf Riders, you will see that their special rules are now in line with the same rules for Empire Pistoliers. Next, we move on to the Dwarf Army. The Gyrocopter has had a similar rules clarification as Pistoliers and Wolf Riders to discuss its 360-degree vision. There was a further proposal which did not pass the vote this year. In order to make the Dwarf Hero a more viable choice when compared to the Runesmith, it was proposed that the Runesmith's type be changed from Hero to Wizard, which would automatically reduce their command range to 20 centimeters. This would, by comparison, make the hero a more attractive option, as they retained their command range of 60 centimeters. And it would also bring the Runesmith more in line with wizards from other armies, as their anti-magic ability is roughly equivalent to the ability to cast spells. However, this change was felt to be too much of a nerf to the Dwarf Army as a whole, so it's back to the drawing board to try and make the Dwarf Hero a more attractive option. Next up, it's the Scaven Army. The only change is the wording for gutter runners, who've received the same rules clarification for their 360-degree vision as pistoliers and wolf riders. Moving on to the Lizardmen next. Skinks have had the rules clarification for their 360-degree vision. Salamanders have the rules streamlining for all skirmisher stands. And Pterodons have the 360-degree vision clarification, as does the Stegodon. Next, it's Kislev, who have received a change to their army list. If you look at the Winged Lancers entry, you'll see that they are now 110 points per unit, but their min-max has been capped at 0 to 3 per 1,000 points. Their special rules have now been changed so that they always gain +1 attack in the first round of combat when they fight to their front, and they are immune to terror. This change has been implemented to make Winged Lancers a more viable choice in the Kislev list, as befits such an iconic unit. They are now slightly undercosted when compared to similar units from other lists such as the Wood Elf Wild Riders. But this is entirely intentional, as you have to look at the performance of a unit in a list as a whole, rather than comparing stats across armies. For many years the feedback has been that Winged Lancers underperformed, so the hope is that this change to their rules will make Winged Lancers a far more competitive pick, and allow you to field multiple units in a thematic Kislev list without it being seen as attacks. Next, it's Horse Archers and Cossacks, who have the same 360-degree vision clarification as Pistoliers. Next, we look at the Vampire Counts. Their only change is the same as the Tomb Kings, and that's their clarification of the wording for Raised Dead. Now let's look at the Arabi Army. First off, the Desert Riders have a clarification of their 360-degree vision rule, and also the same rule for Magic Carpets. Now moving on to the Dogs of War, and their Light Cavalry entry has the same rules clarification as Pistoliers and Wolf Riders. After them, it's the Ogres, and the special rules for Gorgers have had a minor clarification, in that when issuing an ambush order for Gorgers, you don't apply any distance modifiers from the character issuing the order to the place where the Gorgers will appear. Moving on to the Goblins, and it's the Wolf Riders that have their 360-degree vision rule clarified. Now for the Witch Hunters, who have had a change to their army list. Firstly, their Pistoliers now have the same special rule wording as Empire Pistoliers. But secondly, Warhounds have had a change to their special rules. Warhounds can now only be added to infantry units, not Pistoliers, but they can be added to any infantry unit in the army. The previous rules wording was problematic, as Warhounds previously always counted as having 0 armour, but could be added to a unit that had 5+ armour, which made allocating hits from shooting problematic. Also, placing an infantry stand in a unit of cavalry was not aesthetically pleasing. By limiting the Warhounds to joining infantry only, these problems are removed, although the Warhounds have lost their ability to move 30 centimetres. As a skirmisher stand, their special rules are now more in line with those of Empire skirmishers. The big bonus that Warhounds now provide the army is that a unit of infantry joined by a Warhound stand gains the ability to pursue cavalry and chariots. As you can imagine, the Warhounds being released to harry the retreating enemy, allowing the infantry to catch them up. Overall, this now gives the Witch Hunter infantry army a tactical option, which is far more thematic for the unit. The Chaos Dwarfs are next, and they have also received changes to their army list. First up, when you look at the Chaos Dwarf Army selector, you'll notice that the Lamassu monstrous mount has gone up to 35 points, and this points increase better reflects its dispel ability, for an army that also has access to magic. Next, the Hobgoblin units, that is infantry and wolf riders, both have a clarification of their 360-degree vision rule. And finally, the limit on Earthshakers and Death Rockets has been restored to its previous restrictions of a total of 1 piece out of the 2 choices per 1,000 points. This is based on player feedback, where it was felt that too many artillery pieces made the Chaos Dwarf army too powerful, particularly when playing in static games where there was no incentive to advance to gain objectives. Moving on, we have the Wood Elves. As a skirmish unit, War Dancers have their special rules brought in line with Empire skirmishers. And Warhawk Riders have the clarification over their 360-degree line of sight. The Beastmen army is next, and they have benefited from the most number of positive changes this year. Firstly, if you look at the army selector, you will see that the compulsory infantry units have had their names and stats changed. Beast herds have now correctly been renamed as Gore, and their profile now mirrors that of Orc infantry, with 4 attacks, 3 hits and 6 armour for 60 points. This profile is a much better reflection of Beastmen melee infantry, and actually makes ambushing Gore herds quite a prospect for the enemy to deal with. Secondly, the herdkin are correctly changed to Ungore, because that's what they are. Herdkin have never existed in any version of Warhammer or Warmaster. Their stat line remains the same, but they've received a points reduction to 45 points a unit. The reason for this is that Ungore now only have a shooting range of 15 centimeters rather than 30. And this better reflects the faction as a whole, as Beastmen are not known for their shooting ability, and Ungores will carry short bows at best. It also makes Ungore a less powerful option to ambush, as their threat projection range is now halved. And this in turn makes the Gore the more attractive ambushing option, as they can deal some serious damage now if they get into the enemy's flanks or rear. These changes were necessary to make the Beastmen army play more like it's supposed to in the lore, an aggressive ambushing melee army, not a shooting army. And you should now be able to rely more on your Gore units to get stuck in combat, rather than hand back and support the fancier units in the army. You will also see that Centigores now have the same 360-degree vision rule as other similar units, as does the Chaos Spawn. And finally, the Screaming Arrow spell has now been replaced with a more useful entry, Traitorkin. With the reduction in shooting range for the Ungore, the Screaming Arrow spell is now obsolete. And personally, I always found it rather out of place in the Beastman list. The Traitorkin spell is essentially a copy of the Bretonnian Eerie Mist spell, with the caveat that it only affects enemy cavalry, chariots or monsters, as it can only affect beasts. Next up we have the Cathay Army. The Hu Cavalry has the same rules clarification as other units with 360-degree vision. Moving on to Nepon, they have had some minor changes to their army list. Firstly, the Samurai Compulsory Infantry have now had a unit cap placed on them as no more than 4 per 1,000 points. And this is intentional to encourage players to pick a variety of troops from their army selector rather than focus on the most cost effective. There was also a proposal to change the Shugenja from a hero to a wizard in the same manner as Dwarf runesmiths, but this proposal was not successful for the same reasons as the Dwarf list. The Ninja have their 360-degree vision rules clarified, whilst there was also a proposal to make the Honour and Duty Army rule cost something by inflating the cost of the general by 20 points. But this proposal failed and more playtest evidence is needed. Moving on to the Regiments of Renown optional units, they have received some minor wording changes for certain units. Mengil's Manflayers now have the standard 360-degree vision rule, as do Longdrong's Slayer Pirates, as do Al-Mukhtar's Desert Dogs, Ogler Khan's Wolf Boys and Titchiwich's Raiders. That now concludes the changes to the army lists for 2024, and you will have realised that the vast majority of changes are simply special rules clarifications. The big winners this year are the Beastmen, with Kislev coming a close second, whilst Chaos, Chaos Dwarfs and Witch Hunters having some minor cosmetic changes. And this is where the Rules Committee now hands over to you, the player, and the community as a whole. Play some games with or against the armies that have benefited from the changes this year and let us know what you think. The best way to report feedback to the Rules Committee is via the Experimental Rules Forum, and I will include the link below. You can of course comment on the Facebook page or the Discord server, as members of the Rules Committee do frequent these social media platforms, but due to the nature of such forums, posts there may be missed. Therefore, the Experimental Rules Forum is the best way to get our attention. Before we conclude, there has been one more minor change that has been voted on this year, but this is to the wording of a rule in the compendium, which won't be subject to a reprint for a number of years. Therefore, this update will only be found in the Warmaster journal. The restriction preventing attached skirmisher stands from benefiting for the rules for a magic standard carried by its parent unit will be removed. This means Empire Skirmishers, Wood Elf War Dancers, Lizardmen Salamanders and Witch Hunter Warhounds will now get the full benefit of any magic standard carried by their parent unit. This now concludes our video on the changes to the rules for Warmaster in 2024. Thank you for watching, and as always let me know what you think of these changes in the comments below.